So when will I finally see the house you bought for me? I didn't think it was a dangerous question when I asked it. In fact, I asked it the way any mother might ask her son about something he had once promised, with a proud smile and a hug. It was supposed to be a happy topic, something warm to bring up at the dinner table on a quiet Sunday evening. But the moment the words left my mouth, something in the room changed. My name is Margaret Wilson, I'm 67 years old. And after living most of my life believing I understood my family, that simple question made me realize how little I actually knew about what was happening around me. We were sitting at Daniel and Rachel's house, the one about 20 minutes outside the city, the one with the wide porch and the maple tree that turns bright red every October. Daniel had grilled chicken out back. Rachel had made mashed potatoes and green beans, and everything looked perfectly normal. The television murmured softly in the living room, while the late evening sun slipped through the blinds in narrow golden lines across the dining table. Daniel was talking about work, something about a new project his company had taken on, the kind of thing that sounded important even though I didn't really follow the details. Rachel nodded along while cutting her chicken into careful little pieces. I waited for a pause in the conversation, smiled, and asked the question. So when will I finally see the house you bought for me? Daniel looked up first, blinking once like he needed a second to process what I had said. But it wasn't Daniel's reaction that caught my attention. It was Rachel's. Her fork stopped halfway to her mouth. Not dramatically, not like in the movies, just a small pause that most people probably wouldn't have noticed. But I did. I've spent decades raising a child, managing a household, watching people carefully. Small pauses say a lot more than loud arguments. Rachel slowly placed her fork back down on her plate. She didn't look at me. Instead, she reached for her glass of water and took a long sip, her eyes fixed on the table like the wood grain had suddenly become fascinating. The silence that followed stretched longer than it should have. Daniel chuckled softly, almost awkwardly. "The house," he said, glancing between Rachel and me. And that was when the first small crack appeared in the story I thought I understood. Months earlier, Daniel had come to visit me with that excited energy he used to have when he was a kid bringing home good news from school. He had sat at my kitchen table, taken my hands, and told me he wanted to do something special for me after everything that had happened since my husband passed away. "Mom," he had said, "I bought you a place. A little house. Somewhere quiet. You deserve that." I remember laughing and crying at the same time because the idea sounded too generous, too thoughtful, the kind of thing you never expect but secretly hope might happen someday. Rachel had been sitting beside him that afternoon, smiling politely. Not overly excited, not unhappy either, just calm and supportive. At least that's how it seemed back then. Since that day, though, something about the house had always remained strangely vague. I never received an address. I never saw a set of keys. Every time I asked when I might visit, the answer was always something small and harmless sounding. "Soon. They're finishing paperwork. We just need to finalize a few things." Reasonable explanations. At least they felt reasonable at the time. Sitting there at the dinner table, watching Rachel stare quietly into her glass of water, I suddenly realized that none of those explanations had ever actually led anywhere. Daniel leaned back in his chair and rubbed the back of his neck. "Oh," he said slowly, "right, the house." Rachel finally looked up, but not at me. She looked at Daniel. Just for a second. And in that single second something passed between them that I couldn't quite read. Then she forced a small smile and said softly, "Margaret, these things take time. You know how paperwork can be." Maybe that answer would have satisfied someone else. But as I sat there listening to the careful calmness in her voice, a strange feeling settled in my chest. Not anger. Not yet. Just a quiet, uncomfortable question forming in the back of my mind. Because for the first time I started to wonder if the house my son said he bought for me was actually mine at all. The rest of dinner continued, but the warmth that had filled the room earlier seemed to fade into something thinner and harder to describe. Daniel started talking again about his work project, explaining something about budgets and construction schedules, but his voice sounded slightly forced now, like someone trying to keep a conversation moving across a patch of ice. Rachel nodded at the right moments and added small comments when necessary, yet every time I looked at her she seemed just a little too careful, the way people become when they are trying not to say the wrong thing. I kept my smile polite and finished my meal, but my mind had already started replaying the past few months piece by piece. After my husband Thomas passed away 3 years earlier, life had become quieter than I expected. Our house in Ohio had always been full of noise, weekend barbecues, the television humming in the background, neighbors stopping by for coffee. When it was just me, the silence sometimes felt like walking into a large empty church. Daniel had been worried about that. At least that is what he told me. One afternoon last winter, he had driven the 2 hours to my place without warning. Snow had covered the yard and he tracked little wet footprints across the kitchen floor as he came in carrying a grocery bag, and that familiar determined look on his face. He made coffee, sat across from me at the small wooden table Thomas and I had bought 25 years earlier, and said he had been thinking about my future. He said I deserved a fresh start somewhere closer to them, somewhere safe and comfortable where I would not have to worry about maintaining an old house by myself. That was the first time he mentioned the new place. I remember the exact words because they felt so generous that they almost made me embarrassed. He said he had found a small house about 15 minutes from where he and Rachel lived, something simple but bright, with a garden in the back and enough space for me to host Sunday dinners if I wanted. He said he had already started the process of buying it for me as a surprise. I asked him at least 3 times if he was serious. Each time he laughed and squeezed my hand and said of course he was serious. Rachel had been there that afternoon as well, sitting quietly beside him with a cup of tea. She smiled when Daniel talked about the garden, and said she thought it would be lovely for me to have a place closer to them. At the time I believed every word of it. I even started imagining the house in small quiet moments, picturing the kind of curtains I might hang in the kitchen window, or where I would put the rocking chair that used to belong to my grandmother. But after that day, the details never seemed to settle into anything real. Every time I asked Daniel about the closing date or whether I should start packing some boxes, the answers stayed vague. Paperwork delays, inspections, a few legal things that needed time. Perfectly reasonable explanations, at least on the surface. Back at the dinner table, Rachel suddenly stood up and gathered a few plates, saying she would start clearing the dishes. Daniel followed her into the kitchen to help. I could hear their voices from the other room, low and quiet, not quite whispers but close enough that the words blurred together. I sat there for a moment with my hands folded in my lap, listening to the clink of dishes and the soft rush of water from the sink. Something about the way they spoke to each other now felt different from earlier in the evening. Not angry, not tense exactly, but cautious. Like two people trying to coordinate a story without saying it out loud. After a minute, Daniel returned with an easy smile that did not quite reach his eyes. He leaned against the doorway and said they were still working out a few final details on the property, but everything was moving forward. I nodded and thanked him because that seemed like the polite thing to do. Yet as I drove home later that night, the highway stretching quiet and dark in front of me, a thought kept circling in my mind that refused to settle. If the house truly existed, why had I never once seen so much as a photograph of it? That night the drive back to my house felt longer than usual. The highway was mostly empty, just a few trucks passing in the opposite direction, their headlights sweeping across the dark fields like brief flashes of daylight. I kept both hands on the steering wheel and tried to focus on the road, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the dinner table, and that small moment when Rachel had gone quiet. It was not what she said that bothered me. It was what she did not say. For months I had accepted the idea that the house Daniel mentioned was simply caught in the slow gears of paperwork and inspections, the kind of delays everyone complains about when buying property. Yet the longer I thought about it, the more unusual the situation began to feel. When I finally pulled into my driveway, the porch light had already switched on automatically, casting a soft yellow glow across the front yard. The house looked exactly the same as it had every night for the past 3 years, steady and familiar, but suddenly it did not feel as permanent as it once had. I went inside, set my purse on the kitchen counter, and poured myself a glass of water. The clock on the microwave read 9:47. Normally I would turn on the television or read a few pages of a book before bed, but instead I found myself sitting at the small kitchen table staring at the quiet room. That was when another memory surfaced, one that had seemed unimportant at the time but now felt different. About 6 weeks earlier, Daniel had called me on a Tuesday afternoon, while I was trimming the rose bushes in the yard. I remember the date clearly because the weather had been unusually warm for early spring, almost 70 degrees, and I had been enjoying the sunlight. Daniel sounded cheerful on the phone, the way he often did when he thought he had good news. He asked how I was feeling and whether I had been thinking about the move he mentioned earlier in the year. I told him I had started looking through old boxes in the attic, just to see what I might want to bring with me someday. There was a short pause on the line before he responded. Not long, just a couple of seconds, but enough for me to notice. Then he said something that had puzzled me even then. He said I should not worry about packing too soon because the house situation was still developing. At the time I assumed he meant the closing process had not finished yet. But now, sitting alone at my kitchen table, I realized he had never actually used the word closing at all. The phrase he chose was still developing. The next morning I woke up earlier than usual. Sunlight was just beginning to reach the edge of the backyard when I made my coffee and sat down with my laptop. I have never considered myself particularly skilled with technology, but I know how to search for basic information when I need to. Daniel had once mentioned that the place he found for me was somewhere near their neighborhood, about 15 minutes away. That was not much to work with, but it was a start. I typed the name of their town into the search bar and began scrolling through local real estate listings. Small houses, townhomes, a few older properties with gardens like the one Daniel had described. As I clicked through photos and descriptions, I realized something simple yet unsettling. If Daniel had truly purchased a home in that area within the last few months, there should have been some record of it somewhere online. Property sales leave trails. Listings remain archived. Addresses appear in county records. Yet no matter how long I searched that morning, nothing seemed to match the story I had been told. Around 10 o'clock my phone buzzed on the table. It was a message from Daniel asking if I got home safely the night before. I looked at the screen for a moment before typing back that I had. Then I added a second sentence without thinking too much about it. I wrote that I had been curious about the house again, and wondered if he could send me the address sometime soon so I could drive by and take a look. 3 little dots appeared on the screen indicating he was typing. Then they disappeared. A few seconds later they appeared again. Finally a message arrived that simply said he would check with Rachel about the details and get back to me. That answer should have been harmless. Instead it made the quiet kitchen around me feel suddenly much larger and much colder. I sat there staring at Daniel's message for a long moment before placing my phone face down on the kitchen table. The house felt unusually quiet that morning. The kind of quiet that makes every small sound seem louder than it really is. The refrigerator hummed softly in the corner and somewhere outside a lawnmower started up down the street, but inside my kitchen everything felt still. What bothered me was not that Daniel needed to check with Rachel. Married couples talk things over all the time. That part was normal. What unsettled me was the simple question forming in my mind. Why would Rachel know the address of a house that was supposedly bought for me better than Daniel did? I had raised my son for 35 years before he met her. He was not the kind of person who forgot details about something important, especially not something as meaningful as buying a home for his own mother. I tried to shake the thought away and focus on my usual routine. I washed the coffee mug, watered the small plants on the windowsill, and folded the blanket I had left on the couch the night before. Still, the question followed me from room to room like a quiet shadow. By early afternoon Daniel still had not replied with the address. That alone might not have meant anything, but it reminded me of something else. Over the past several months, every time the subject of the house came up, Rachel somehow became part of the explanation. Daniel would say he needed to check something with Rachel, or that Rachel had been handling part of the paperwork, or that Rachel was waiting for confirmation from someone involved in the process. At the time I assumed it was simply because she was more organized with documents and emails. But now the pattern felt a little too consistent to ignore. Around 3 o'clock I decided to take a short drive just to clear my head. The weather had turned pleasant again, about 72 degrees with a light breeze moving through the trees. I drove toward Daniel's town, the same road I had taken dozens of times before for family dinners and holidays. The drive took about 40 minutes if traffic was light, passing through a stretch of farmland before the road curved into a small suburban area filled with tidy houses and neatly trimmed lawns. Daniel and Rachel lived in a quiet neighborhood where most of the homes looked similar, 2-story houses with garages and wide sidewalks. I parked on the street across from their place for a moment and looked around. If Daniel had truly purchased another home nearby, it had to be somewhere within a short distance. That was the story he had told me. 15 minutes away, maybe even closer. I began driving slowly through the surrounding streets, paying attention to the small signs placed in front of properties. Some houses had real estate signs with the word sold printed across them. Others had open house notices scheduled for the weekend. I drove past park after park, small ponds, rows of comfortable-looking homes with porches and flower beds. Yet nothing stood out as the place Daniel had once described to me. There was no small house with a garden waiting for a rocking chair by the window. No property that felt like the beginning of a new chapter. After nearly half an hour of wandering through the neighborhood streets, I finally pulled into a small coffee shop parking lot near the main road. I ordered a cup of coffee and sat by the window watching cars pass by outside. As I stirred sugar into the cup, I found myself replaying Daniel's message again in my mind. He would check with Rachel about the details. It sounded harmless enough on the surface. But the more I thought about it, the more a strange possibility began to form quietly in the back of my mind. What if the reason I had never seen the house was not because paperwork was slow? What if the reason was something much simpler than that? What if the house I had been promised was never meant for me at all? I sat in that small coffee shop for nearly 40 minutes, watching the slow movement of cars through the intersection outside the window, while the same thought continued to circle through my mind. It was not a loud realization, not the kind that arrives like a sudden shock. It was quieter than that. It felt more like a small piece of truth slowly settling into place where something else had once been. For months I had believed a story because I trusted the person who told it to me. Daniel had always been a good son. When he was a child he never forgot birthdays, never ignored a promise once he made it. That was the boy I raised. That was the man I believed I still knew. Yet the longer I sat there stirring the last bit of sugar into my coffee, the more I realized how many small pieces of the story about the house had never quite fit together. When I finished my drink I stepped outside and stood beside my car for a moment, letting the mild afternoon air clear my head. The sun was beginning to lower in the sky and long shadows stretched across the parking lot. Before getting into the driver's seat I took out my phone and checked my messages again. There was still no reply from Daniel. That alone might not have meant anything, but the silence now felt heavier than it had earlier in the day. Instead of driving straight home, I decided to make one more slow pass through the nearby streets around Daniel's neighborhood. This time I paid closer attention not just to the houses themselves but to the small details posted near the sidewalks. Real estate signs often include the name of the agent and the agency that handled the sale. After about 10 minutes of driving, I noticed a sign planted neatly in front of a light gray house with white shutters. The word sold was printed clearly across the middle in bold red letters. Normally I would have driven right past something like that without a second thought, but something about it made me slow down. Perhaps it was the size of the property. It was not a large house, just a simple single-story place with a narrow garden bed along the front porch and a small tree in the yard. The kind of house someone might describe as comfortable and easy to manage. The kind of house Daniel once told me he had found for me. I parked along the curb and stepped out of the car to look at the sign more closely. The agency name was printed across the bottom along with a phone number. I stood there for a moment thinking about whether I should call it. Part of me felt foolish for even considering the idea. After all, thousands of houses are sold every year. This could have belonged to anyone. Still, something about the coincidence lingered in my mind. I finally decided that making a simple phone call would not hurt anything. I returned to my car, sat down, and dialed the number listed on the sign. A friendly voice answered after 2 rings and introduced herself as Karen from the local real estate office. I explained politely that I was curious about the property that had recently sold on that street because my son had mentioned purchasing a house nearby. Karen sounded helpful and asked for the address written on the sign. I read it to her while glancing back through the windshield at the quiet gray house across the road. I could hear her typing on a keyboard for a few seconds before she responded. She confirmed that the property had indeed been sold recently, just about 2 months earlier. Then she mentioned the name of the buyer. For a moment I thought I had misheard her, because the name sounded so familiar that it did not make sense. I asked her to repeat it. Karen read it again slowly, clearly, as if she were simply reviewing a line from a document. The buyer of that small gray house with the garden was Rachel Wilson. For a few seconds after Karen said the name, I did not respond at all. I simply sat there in the driver's seat with my phone against my ear, staring through the windshield at the small gray house across the street. The porch looked quiet and tidy, the garden bed freshly turned as if someone had recently planted new flowers. Nothing about it looked unusual. Nothing about it suggested that the simple story I had believed for months had just changed in a single sentence. Karen politely asked if I was still on the line. I cleared my throat and told her yes, I was just thinking. Then I asked a question as calmly as I could manage. I asked if the purchase had been made recently. She confirmed again that the closing had taken place about 2 months earlier. She even mentioned that the buyers seemed very excited about the property, because it was close to family, and located in a quiet neighborhood. I thanked her for the information, told her I appreciated her time, and ended the call. When the line went silent, I slowly lowered the phone into my lap and sat there without moving. 2 months earlier. That meant the house had been purchased around the same time Daniel first told me he had bought a place for me. The timeline fit almost perfectly. Yet the name on the property was not Daniel's. It was not mine either. It was Rachel's. I tried to think of reasonable explanations. Perhaps they had placed the property under Rachel's name for tax reasons. Perhaps Daniel had simply simplified the story when he explained it to me that winter afternoon. Those kinds of arrangements happen sometimes in families. Still, the uneasy feeling in my chest refused to fade. If the house truly belonged to me in the way Daniel described, why had no one mentioned that Rachel was the official buyer? Why had every conversation about the property remained so vague? I looked at the gray house again. The curtains in the front window were open and I could see a glimpse of the living room inside. It looked empty, or at least not fully furnished yet. No lights were on, and the driveway beside the house was clear. For a moment I considered walking up the front path just to take a closer look, but I decided against it. Showing up unannounced would only create more questions, and I still did not understand enough to ask the right ones. Instead I started the car and drove slowly away from the curb. As I turned onto the next street, another thought settled quietly into place. If Rachel had purchased that house 2 months ago, then Daniel must have known about it from the beginning. There was no reasonable way he could have missed something that large. Which meant the story he told me at my kitchen table that winter afternoon had not been entirely true. The drive home felt different from the drive earlier that day. The same road stretched ahead of me, the same farmland and small intersections, but the sense of confusion had shifted into something clearer. It was no longer a vague suspicion. Now it was a question waiting for an answer. When I finally pulled into my driveway, the sun had nearly set, leaving the sky a pale orange fading into gray. I turned off the engine and sat quietly for a moment before going inside. My phone buzzed just as I reached the front door. It was a new message from Daniel. He wrote that he had spoken with Rachel and that the house situation was still complicated, but he promised they would explain everything soon. I read the message once, then a second time. After what I had learned that afternoon, the words felt strangely distant, like listening to a story that no longer belonged to me. I placed the phone back in my purse and unlocked the door to my house. Inside, the familiar quiet greeted me again, but this time the silence felt different. Now I knew something they did not realize yet. And for the first time since Daniel mentioned the house months earlier, I began to wonder whether I should keep that knowledge to myself a little while longer. I slept very little that night. It was not because I felt angry, at least not yet. What kept me awake was the quiet feeling that something important had shifted, like a small crack appearing in the foundation of a house you had lived in for years without ever questioning its strength. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling fan turning slowly above me, replaying the conversation with the real estate agent over and over in my mind. Rachel Wilson. The name had sounded so ordinary when Karen said it, just another buyer in a long list of property records. Yet to me it meant everything had changed. By the time morning sunlight began creeping through the curtains, I had already made a decision. I was not going to confront Daniel immediately. I had spent too many years raising him to believe that problems should be handled with patience rather than emotion. If there was an explanation, I wanted to hear it fully before making assumptions. But patience does not mean ignorance. And now that I knew the address of the gray house with the small garden, I wanted to see it properly. After breakfast I dressed for the day and drove back toward Daniel's town again. The sky was bright and clear, the kind of calm morning that usually makes a person feel optimistic about the day ahead. I followed the same roads as the afternoon before, passing the same farms and quiet intersections until the familiar neighborhood appeared ahead. This time I did not wander through the streets. I drove directly to the address Karen had confirmed on the phone. The gray house looked exactly the same as it had the previous afternoon, quiet and almost welcoming in its simplicity. I parked a short distance down the street and sat there for a moment observing the property. In daylight I could see more details. The small front garden had neat rows of fresh soil, and a narrow stone path led from the sidewalk to the porch. Someone had clearly spent time preparing the place recently. After a few minutes I noticed a movement in the driveway. A dark blue car turned slowly onto the street and parked beside the house. The driver's door opened and a woman stepped out carrying what looked like a small box. Even before she turned fully toward the porch, I recognized her. It was Rachel. She walked up the path with an easy familiarity, the kind of movement someone has when they already know exactly where the key is kept. She unlocked the front door, stepped inside, and disappeared from view as if she had done it many times before. I sat there gripping the steering wheel without realizing it. For months I had imagined this place as my future home, a quiet little house where I might start a new chapter after losing my husband. Yet the person walking through that front door as if it belonged to her was not me. It was my daughter-in-law. I remained parked down the street for nearly 15 minutes, watching the windows of the house in silence. Eventually the front door opened again and Rachel stepped out onto the porch, placing the empty box near the steps before going back inside. The action seemed simple enough, like someone gradually moving belongings into a new property. The longer I watched, the clearer the truth became. This house had never been waiting for me. It had been waiting for Rachel all along. I started the engine slowly and drove away before she had any chance of noticing my car. As I turned onto the main road, a strange calm settled over me. The confusion of the past few days was gone now, replaced by something much sharper. Daniel's message from the night before echoed again in my mind. He said the situation was complicated and that they would explain everything soon. I wondered how they planned to explain a house that already had someone else moving into it. The drive back from that neighborhood felt strangely calm compared to the confusion of the day before. My hands rested lightly on the steering wheel while the road stretched ahead in long quiet lines, and for the first time since Daniel had told me about the house months earlier, the pieces of the story no longer felt scattered. They had begun to fit together in a way that was impossible to ignore. Rachel had bought the house. I had seen her walking into it with my own eyes, unlocking the door as naturally as someone returning to a place that belonged to her. Whatever explanation Daniel planned to give me, the truth was already sitting there in that quiet gray house with the garden. When I arrived home, I made myself a cup of tea and sat down at the kitchen table, the same table where Daniel had once held my hands and promised that he had found a little place for me to start fresh. The memory felt different now, almost like watching a scene from a play after learning how the story ends. At the time his voice had sounded sincere, even proud, as if he truly believed he was doing something generous. I tried to understand how that moment could exist alongside the reality I had just witnessed. Perhaps Daniel believed he could manage the situation later. Perhaps he thought the truth would never surface in a way that forced him to explain it. Families sometimes tell small lies to avoid uncomfortable conversations. But a lie about a house is not a small thing. It carries weight, time, and money behind it. Later that afternoon my phone rang, while I was folding laundry in the living room. The name on the screen was Daniel. I let it ring once more before answering, partly because I wanted a moment to steady my voice. When I picked up, he sounded cheerful in that careful way people sometimes use when they are preparing to discuss something sensitive. He asked how my morning had been, and whether I had any plans for the weekend. I answered politely, keeping my tone warm but neutral. After a minute he cleared his throat and returned to the subject he had mentioned in his message the night before. He said he and Rachel wanted to explain the situation with the house soon because things had become more complicated than they expected. As he spoke, I looked out the living room window at the quiet street in front of my home, and listened carefully to each word. Daniel explained that Rachel had taken the lead on much of the paperwork when they first began searching for properties. He said that in the beginning the idea had been to find a place nearby where I could live comfortably, but certain financial details had required them to structure the purchase differently. The explanation moved slowly, like someone walking across thin ice while choosing each step with caution. I did not interrupt him. Instead, I waited until he finished and then asked a simple question. I asked whether Rachel had already begun moving things into the house. There was a pause on the line. It was longer than the small silences he had shown during dinner days earlier. Finally he asked why I would think that. I told him calmly that I had driven through the neighborhood that morning, and happened to see Rachel unlocking the front door, and carrying boxes inside. Another long silence followed, and this one felt heavier than the first. I imagined Daniel standing somewhere in his kitchen, perhaps looking toward Rachel as he tried to decide how much of the truth could still be hidden. When he finally spoke again, his voice sounded very different from the cheerful tone he used when the call began. It sounded tired. He said there were things they needed to talk about in person, because the situation had not unfolded the way anyone originally planned. I told him that was fine and that I would be happy to listen whenever they were ready. Then I ended the call gently and placed the phone on the table. For months I had been waiting for someone else to show me the house that was supposed to belong to me. Now I understood that the real conversation waiting ahead was not about a property at all. It was about the truth behind the promise that had been built around it. 2 days later I drove back to Daniel and Rachel's house just before sunset, the same time of day we had shared dinner only a week earlier. The sky was soft and pale with long streaks of orange stretching over the quiet neighborhood, and the maple tree in their front yard rustled gently in the evening breeze. From the outside everything looked exactly the same as it always had. The porch lights were on, the curtains were open, and Daniel's truck sat in the driveway beside Rachel's car. Anyone passing by would have seen nothing unusual about the house. Yet as I stepped out of my car and walked up the familiar path, I knew the conversation waiting inside would not be an ordinary family visit. Daniel opened the door before I even knocked, as if he had been watching for my arrival through the front window. He greeted me with a quick hug that felt slightly tense, the way people sometimes hug when they are unsure how the evening will unfold. Rachel stood in the living room near the couch with her hands folded together, offering a polite smile that did not quite reach her eyes. We all sat down around the coffee table, the same place where we had spent countless holidays and quiet Sunday afternoons over the years. For a moment none of us spoke. Finally Daniel took a slow breath and began explaining. He said that when he first told me about the house months earlier, the idea had been genuine. He truly had wanted to find a small place near them where I could live comfortably after losing Thomas. They had even looked at several properties together before settling on the gray house with the small garden. According to Daniel, the complication began when they realized the mortgage approval process would move faster if the purchase went through Rachel's credit profile rather than his. At first it was meant to be only a temporary arrangement on paper, something that could be adjusted later once everything settled. But as the months passed, other plans began forming around the property. Rachel spoke next, her voice calm but careful. She explained that while preparing the house she had begun to see it differently from the original plan. She said the location was perfect for them, and that eventually they hoped to move there themselves while renting out their current home as an investment. As she spoke I watched Daniel quietly nod beside her, confirming the story with small movements of agreement. The explanation was not shouted or dramatic. It unfolded slowly, almost politely, like a business discussion rather than a family confession. When they finished the room fell silent again. I looked at both of them for a moment before speaking. I told them I understood that life changes and that plans sometimes shift in ways no one expects. What mattered to me was not the house itself but the way the promise around it had been handled. Months earlier Daniel had sat in my kitchen and told me he bought a place specifically for me. That moment had meant something real to me during a time when I was still learning how to live alone again. Daniel lowered his eyes and admitted that he should have explained the situation sooner rather than allowing the story to continue the way it had. Rachel added that she never intended to hurt my feelings, and that the situation had simply become complicated over time. I listened quietly, letting their words settle in the room. Then I told them something simple. I said that a house is made from wood, nails and paint, but trust inside a family is built from honesty. When the conversation ended later that evening I stood up, hugged my son, and thanked them both for finally telling me the truth. As I stepped outside into the cool night air, the porch light glowing behind me, I realized something important. The house with the garden might never belong to me, but the peace that comes from seeing the truth clearly was something no one else could take away.